when they see it. So what kind of experiments can we conduct that use good research designs? And to approach this issue, let's take a look at this simple hypothesis. Imagine that you are a researcher, say a market researcher, and you were hired to compare the taste of two brands of juice, which only differ in the position of letter, R and Ya. Does one of them really taste better than another one? And this is basically an experimental study, potentially. So how would you organize this study to make this inference? What exactly would you do? And I propose you to think, to put this video on pause and think about at least two different possibilities for the next couple of minutes. And then we'll see what possibilities are out there. Now, if you have reflected on this little exercise and you've imagined yourself as a researcher who wants to prove that there is a difference between the taste of one juice and the taste of another juice, obviously we know something about statistics, so probably you did not think of just trying those two juices yourself and making a judgment, as a normal person would probably think. Maybe you thought about at least two different possibilities. In all these situations, we try to obtain much data. We try to collect more information about the two different conditions. We try to measure each condition many times. And there are different ways in which we can organize it. The easiest way is called single participant design. If you want to make a judgment that one juice is better than the other, you need to taste two juices many times in order to obtain a reliable measurement. For example, you're evaluating is it good or is it bad on a 7-point scale, and you have criteria for each point. So the only problem is that you would need an assistant for this, because to remove your expectation effects, you would need an assistant who would pour those juices into the same glasses, who would put them in the fridge to ensure that two juices have the same temperature, and who would monitor which juice is in which glass when they record the results of your evaluation. But then on many days in a row, you can taste those two juices in random sequence, or sometimes maybe just one juice per day. And then you would have a bunch of numbers. You could compare them statistically. And this is how some classical studies were conducted in psychology. If you remember Hermann Ebbinghaus, who came up with this memory curve, or the curve of forgetting, when he showed that if we try to memorize something, we lose most information in the first few hours, and then the rate of loss of information from memory decreases. And he showed it because he basically spent a large part of his life learning meaningless syllables and trying to recall them at different time intervals. And obviously he had assistants who compiled those lists of meaningless syllables, and he was able to plot this classical curve, which is now can be found in every memory textbook. And he discovered it using a single participant. Of course, the main challenge here is external validity, because your juice preferences might not be the same as juice preferences of another person. So you cannot be confident that this generalizes to anyone else. In case of Ebbinghaus, this finding was replicated by many people in many labs, and as a result, it's considered a classical effect. But with juice, we cannot be so confident. That's why, if you are doing a market research, you would probably want to use many people. But you can organize this study in two different ways. Two juices are your two experimental conditions, R and Ya. And you can have two groups of people. Each group will try only one juice, either juice A or juice B. And then you will have data from those two groups. If you randomly assign people to one of those groups, no problem. The main challenge here is that maybe there are individual differences in the preferences of Jews, in the precision of evaluations using this 7-point scale. So you would need to have many people in order to be able to do a good statistical comparison. So if you are using a between group design, you need a large sample. But each person in that sample only tries one juice, so you spend a very short period of time with every participant. Try juice, 1 to 7, go, bye-bye. But you need many people like this. Another option is to have one group of people who will try both juices in sequence. Now, obviously, the main challenge here is not individual differences, but it's the effect of sequence. If people try the first juice, maybe they will like it better, just because it's first and they are thirsty. And when they try a second juice, maybe there will be an effect of contrast or comparison between the two, which will amplify the minor differences in the taste. So when you do a within group design, you administer experimental conditions to the same group of people. Everyone tries all the juices. But the main challenge here is sequence. And there are situations when you can choose between the two designs. And then you can think what is easier for you, to have many people but for a short time, or to have few people but for a longer time. Obviously, with some hypotheses, we don't have this choice. Like, for example, if we are testing psychotherapeutic intervention, or we are testing a teaching program, it is only between group design. You cannot really treat people twice using different psychotherapies for the same problem, or you cannot teach them twice the same material using different teaching programs. So in psychology, sometimes between group design is the only one available. But sometimes in cognitive psychology, you can choose, for example, and they prefer within group designs because they need small samples. So what are the main challenges within each of these designs? Right now, we'll be taking a look at different research designs, and we'll be discussing the different challenges and problems associated with each type. So to begin with, let's just separate two types of experimental designs. Between group designs, when different levels of your independent variable are administered to different groups of people. And when we say levels of independent variable, we mean these characteristics that are potential causes of the effects that we're interested in. So with two juices are two levels of your independent variable juice. If you compare 3 brands of juices, you will have 3 levels, etc. So these levels can be administered to different groups, and this is called the between group design. Or these levels can be administered to the same group of people in sequence. And then you have a within group design. What is the main challenge of between group designs? We have different people in our, let's say, experimental and control group, or in groups that tried juice A and juice B in one shop and in another shop. The main challenge here is ensuring that these people are equivalent, ensuring that nothing else is different across these two conditions except for our independent variable. And the main threat here are individual differences. People are all different. That's why, in order to control or eliminate these individual differences, we use some strategies to form equivalent groups. If one of these strategies is used, this is a true experiment. How can we form equivalent groups? The easiest strategy is random assignment. Every person comes to your lab, you just flip a coin, and you say, okay, heads, experimental group, tails, control group. Of course, you don't tell it to the person, but you assign them this way. Or you can use some kind of random number generator to split people into 2 groups. The advantage of this is that it's very easy, and on average, based on most variables you can think of, your groups will be equivalent. But random assignment does not guarantee group equivalence. This is very important. Imagine that in your sample, you have 10 males and 10 females, and you randomly assign people to experimental and control group. But you may end up with 8 females in one group and 2 males, and 8 males in another group and 2 females. Then obviously your groups will not be quite equivalent. And it's a challenge. Of course, you might say, I will distribute males and females evenly, but you cannot say so about other variables. Gender you can observe, but what about IQ? What about socioeconomic status? What about everything else? You cannot be completely confident that groups are equivalent. So what you can do is, if these variables are strong alternative explanations, you can measure them to control statistically. Or you can use a stronger strategy, which is called matching or stratifying. When you want to control for a specific plausible alternative explanation while still maintaining the random assignment. How does matching work? Imagine that you have a very strong alternative explanation. For example, you are testing the effects of an educational program, and obviously, alternative explanation is always IQ, because people with higher IQ, they learn more easily. People with lower IQ, they have a bit more difficulty learning new material. So if your groups are not equivalent on IQ, you have a problem. That's why you want to ensure that your groups are equivalent on IQ. How do you do it? You measure IQ in all of your participants, and then you sort people on this IQ variable from the highest to the lowest. And then you go through this list and you take every time a pair of participants with similar IQ levels. Like these two people are on top, their IQ is similar, and I will randomly determine which one of them goes to experimental and which one of them goes to control group. Then next pair, next pair, next pair. And this way you end up with two groups where the average level of IQ is exactly equal and where even the distribution shape of IQ is the same. So you can be sure that IQ does not work as alternative explanation. Of course, it is easy with one variable. If you have a combination of variables, it becomes a bit more challenging. And if you don't know the potential alternative explanations, it's impossible to use any kind of matching strategy like this. But for example, for gender, it's very easy. You basically take, you have 10 males, 10 females in your sample, and each time you take basically 10 males, and you randomly assign each male to experimental and control group, and you take 10 females, and for each female you also randomly assign them to experimental or control group. This way you can be sure that the proportion of males and females in both groups will be equal. And this third strategy is called stratifying. So when you create your groups, you don't randomly assign everyone, but you split people into strata and you randomly assign people within each strata. Like males into two groups, females into two groups, then join them, or people with high, medium, and low income, etc. So if this matching or stratifying is combined with random assignment, this is true experiment. Of course, if you just take a bunch of males and a bunch of females and you don't perform any random assignment, this is not a true experiment, because you cannot guarantee group equivalence. But with random assignment, also, you can expect group equivalence on most variables, but you cannot guarantee group equivalence on every variable possible. That's why it is very important to replicate an experiment. If you form random groups twice and in two series you get the same result, then you can be confident that probably your experimental effect holds. It is not just an artifact of group assignment. But if you conduct your experiment just once, you can never be confident. Maybe it happens that people specific on some variable just were in one group and you did not measure this variable and you don't know. Yeah, so these are between group designs. What about within group designs? In within group designs, we have a series of levels of independent variable, and they are all administered to one group of subjects. all people taste different juices in sequence. And here the main challenge is position effects. If they all test juices in one sequence, the first juice maybe they will like, the third juice, when they are already fed up with that juice, they will not like. And there will be systematic differences in the evaluation of juices as a result of brands being on certain positions. Or sometimes there are also sequence effects. If you have two juices that are very different in taste, and if they go one after another, maybe this difference will be amplified because people will perceive the contrast. Or if a salty juice comes after a sweet juice, salty juice will be disgusting. But if salty juice comes before sweet juice, maybe salty juice will be nice. So these are sequence effects. How can we control all those effects? There are also many strategies. Obviously, the easiest strategy is just to randomize the sequence for each subject. If you are performing your study using a computer, for example, and you are showing different pictures, it's very easy to just create a random sequence. Then, on average, all pictures will be in the same position and position effects will not be problematic. We use this strategy when we develop questionnaires, for example, because in a questionnaire, if you have two questions one after another, if they are similar or if they are opposite, this has effect on responses. So if we develop a questionnaire, I normally randomly assign, randomly create a sequence of questions for each participant. And this way I can select the best questions without the influence of position effects. Exactly the same we can use within group experiments. Of course, just organizationally, it may not be possible to randomize the sequence of juices. Imagine you're conducting your study in a store and you have experimental assistants shuffling those little glasses around. Completely impossible not to make a mistake. That's why in such situations we can use other strategies. For example, position equating. Position equating is when we have, for example, three sequences and in each sequence, juice A is number 1 in one sequence, number 2 in the second sequence, number 3 in the third one. In juice B is number 2, number 3, and number 1, etc. So on average, if you take all these sequences together, on average, each juice is in every position at least once. And on average, the average position of juice in sequence across all those sequences is the same. That's position equating. Another strategy is balancing. Usually we use it when we have many different stimuli of, let's say, 2 different types. So we can balance so that always different stimuli are one after another, A, B, A, B. For example, in questionnaires where you have forward scored and reverse scored items, you can actually make it balance it. Or in questionnaires when you have questions that belong to different scales, also you balance them. Another strategy is counterbalancing. If you have just 2 juices, A and B, you can create just 2 sequences. And you can randomly assign people to sequence AB and to sequence BA. This way you have 2 trays with the same juices but in 2 different sequences, and you randomly assign people to one of those 2 trays. Easy to implement even in group settings. So if you use some kind of strategy to control these position effects, you have true experiment. If you don't have any strategy to control position effects, this is not true experiment. It's a quasi-experiment because you cannot rule out the alternative explanations, position or sequence effects. Now let's take a look at some designs, some simple experimental designs. Here you can see a bunch of experimental designs for one independent variable, and these are between group designs. So these are the designs that you are likely going to use if you want to test an educational program or if you want to test a psychotherapeutic intervention. And again, we have three magic letters, R, O, and X. R is randomization, O is observation, and X is treatment. So all of these begin with the letter R, which means that groups are created randomly. And this is a condition for true experiment. So in the first design, which is called pretest post-test randomized control group design, you have two groups formed randomly. One group is measured, then it receives an intervention, and then it's measured again. And another group does not receive this intervention, or maybe there is a placebo intervention. So it's basically what Dolores did, but there is a control group and there is random assignment. And as you can see, all the threats to validity are eliminated. Because groups are formed randomly, there is no difference in group selection. There are no differences in history and maturation because both groups are in the same boat, so to say, etc. So this is a fairly good design. The only challenge, the only minus that you can see here is interaction of testing and treatment. So maybe your treatment only works on people who have been measured at the beginning. Maybe your measurement of dependent variable makes people sensitive to this treatment. They start paying more attention, etc. If you want to rule out this threat to external validity, you might want to use a more complicated design, which is called Solomon for group design, and it was used in educational research fairly often. So instead of splitting your people randomly into two groups and giving them all pretest, you can split your people randomly into 4 groups. And one half of them will get pretest, and another half will not get pretest. And one half of the first half will be treated, another one not, and the same in the second half. So 4 groups and 2 factors, pretest, no pretest, and treatment, no treatment. And each group is a unique combination of these factors. And as you can see, this interaction of testing and treatment is eliminated. Or you can use a third option, which is more simple, and it's called post-test only control group design. If you are lazy, you say, I don't want to do any pretest. I will just do I will form my groups randomly, and I will do my teaching program in one group. I will do nothing in the other group. And at the end, I will just measure my dependent variable at the same time. And as you can see, there are no threats to validity. All the threats to internal validity are controlled, and there is nothing special about external validity. So why on earth do people need this Solomon for group design when just with 2 groups you can achieve the same result? Or why on earth do we need this pretest? Maybe we can get by without it. And this is also a question that we often consider when we plan our research studies. Should we really do pretest? Should we really measure our dependent variable before our actual intervention? And there are good reasons to do the pretest. First of all, pretest allows you to evaluate the effect of attrition. If you remember this word, attrition or mortality, it's a situation when people get lost during your experimental manipulation. Of course, if you invite them to laboratory and you spend half an hour, probably they will not run out from your lab screaming. But if your experiment takes place over several months or even several weeks, you might actually have people who drop out because they are bored with your intervention, or they have other problems in their life, they don't want to participate anymore, and because they are volunteers, they have the right to stop participation at any moment. If you have a pretest information, you can actually check are the people who dropped out any different from those who did not drop out? Are the people who dropped out from one condition any different from those who dropped out from the control group? For example, we did a study of meditation when people were proposed to meditate for 3 weeks. And we found that dropout was about 50% because it was an online course. Of course, it's very boring to meditate every day for 3 weeks and to complete some questionnaires. So it's no surprise that people dropped out. But when we compared people who dropped out and those who did not, we found that in the control group there was no difference. But in the experimental group, there was an important difference: self-regulation skills. And that's why we made this conclusion that meditation actually works. The intervention was effective, but it only works for people who are patient enough to meditate, who have this self-control to actually do this thing every day for 3 weeks. And we managed to make this conclusion because we had pretest scores. Or you can even statistically control for this attrition if you create matched subgroups using pretest scores. This is also a strategy if you have larger samples and if it's very important to create equivalent groups. If you don't have pretest, you have no idea why did people drop out. What is special about people who dropped out? You have no reason to judge. So pretest is good. Another reason why pretest is good is that it increases your statistical power. If you have pretest, you have a higher chance to discover the effect that you are looking for, in case if it exists. But of course, there is a drawback. There is this problem of pretest sensitization. If people have been pretested before, maybe they will treat your treatment slightly differently. Maybe the effect of treatment might be slightly different. Of course, sometimes you may say it's not a problem, probably, or sometimes you might say it's a problem, depending on the situation. So when you choose between those experimental designs, you can think, do you really need a pretest or not? In most cases, it's better to have it than not. Another question that is also very practical: how many people do we need per group? Unfortunately, there is no simple answer, because how many people you need per group depends on how strong is your statistical effect. And this decision needs to be based on some knowledge of how strong is your experimental effect and analysis of statistical power. We will learn how to perform this analysis in our topic number 7, when we will discuss statistical power in detail. So far, what we can say right now is that if you use a within group design, you need to have a much smaller sample size than for a between group design. Because when you do a between group design, individual differences contribute a lot to measurement error. If you use a within group design, individual differences do not play any detrimental role. So you can have pretty much the same statistical power with 30 people in a within group design as with, say, 100 in a between group design. But obviously this is special to each hypothesis. If you use a between group design, your groups don't really have to be equal. But if you have equal groups, this increases your statistical power. And this allows you to conduct your analysis with a little bit more ease. So it's best to have equal groups, but if they are not equal, it's not the end of the world. And obviously, the number of levels of independent variable can also be very different. You can do, for example, a design comparing 2 different treatments, existential therapy and Gestalt therapy, for example. Or you can do the same by adding a control group. You randomly assign people to either existential therapist or Gestalt therapist or to a wait list, and you say, could you please come next month when the therapist becomes available? And that will be wait list control. Or you can combine the same thing with pretest. And as a result, you can get better statistical power. So if you have more than 2 levels of your independent variable, instead of putting x and nothing, you can mark them xa, xb, and x0, for example, to make it more easy to understand your research design. And another question that we face is how many levels of independent variable do we want to use? Of course, sometimes we have no choice. If it's treatment, no treatment, 2 levels, that's it. But sometimes you have some kind of dimension behind those levels. Let's say, for example, you are showing pictures that are scary and neutral. Or you might want to show 3 types of pictures: very scary, a little scary, and neutral. How do you make the choice? And again, there are advantages and drawbacks. If you have more levels, you are able to detect the association of your independent variable with your dependent variable more accurately. For example, here in this study, people tried to investigate how nice or how appealing are different kinds of music. And those different kinds of music were given in different tempo. Slow tempo, 60 beats per minute, medium and fast tempo. And there were 3 types of music: minor music, major music, and atonal music. And if you look at this graph, you can see that actually for minor music and for atonal music, if it's fast, it feels a little bit nicer to people than if it's slow. But if it's major music, when it's too fast, it starts becoming less appealing. So for major music, a medium tempo appears to be optimal. And if you compare across these individual conditions, you can statistically evaluate the truth of these conclusions. Now imagine that they did not have a medium tempo. Imagine that they only had slow tempo and fast tempo. Then for major music, they would conclude that maybe tempo has no effect on how appealing it is at all. But this would not be quite true, because there is a kind of curvilinear relationship probably. And they managed to detect this relationship thanks to having 3 groups of different tempo rather than just 2. But of course, more experimental conditions means larger sample size. Because if you split your sample into 2 groups, you have more people in each group. If you split the same sample into 3 groups, you have fewer people in each group. And at some point, this number of people might be too small to give you acceptable statistical power. That's why if you have more groups, you also normally need to increase your sample size somewhat. And here, for example, if you have 2 groups, you need 30 people. If you have 3 groups, to achieve the same statistical power, you will need 45 people. But if you have 5 groups, you will need about 60 people. So you can reduce a little bit the number of people per group, but not much. This is just an example for a specific hypothesis and for a specific effect. For your particular effect, this shape of this association might be slightly different, but the logic is pretty much the same. The more groups you have, the larger normally needs to be your sample. So you cannot take 30 people and split them into 10 groups and pretend that you have some trustworthy results.